What if I told you a tiny insect, barely visible, could bring empires to their knees?
I'd say you're about to tell me about yellow fever.
You got it. We've got a stack of research here.
Oh, wow.
Excerpts from a book called The Fever That Changed the World, plus some deep dives into the virus itself. But for you, let's start in 1793.
Okay.
Imagine Philadelphia, a bustling capital city struck by a terrifying epidemic.
Uh-huh.
People turning yellow, vomiting, black bile panic in the streets.
And this wasn't just any outbreak. Philadelphia was one of the most important cities in the newly formed United States.
Right.
The government fled, businesses shuttered, and thousands perished.
A true catastrophe. But the real mystery wasn't the disease's severity,
Right.
but how it spread.
Yeah.
Theories abounded: bad air, direct contagion, but none fit perfectly.
What's fascinating is this mystery persisted for centuries.
Wow.
Yellow fever outbreaks continued to shape history, from Napoleon's failed ambitions in Haiti to the near abandonment of the Panama Canal construction.
So for centuries, this invisible enemy wreaked havoc, leaving a trail of devastation and unanswered questions.
Right.
Therefore, the stage was set for a scientific detective story.
And enter our first detective, Carlos Finlay, a Cuban physician who in 1881 proposed a radical idea.
Okay.
Mosquitoes were the culprits, specifically the Aedes aegypti mosquito.
Talk about a controversial theory.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to convince the medical establishment of the time that a tiny mosquito was responsible for this devastating disease.
He faced enormous pushback. Finlay meticulously observed outbreaks in Havana, even attempting experiments, but his findings were largely dismissed. Scientific community just wasn't ready to accept such a radical notion.
But Finlay's work, though, ridiculed, planted a seed.
Yeah.
Fast forward to 1900, the Spanish-American War is raging and yellow fever is decimating. U.S. troops enter Walter Reed and his team, desperate for answers.
And they were willing to take extraordinary risks to find them. Reed's experiments in Havana involved human volunteers, including members of his own team. They were intentionally exposed to mosquitoes that had bitten yellow fever patients.
Talk about putting your life on the line for science, but their bravery paid off.
Uh-huh.
The volunteers exposed to the infected mosquitoes developed yellow fever, while those who weren't. Didn't Finlay have been right all along?
This was a monumental discovery, and it shifted the focus from treating the disease to controlling the mosquito that carried it.
But why this particular mosquito? What makes Aedes aegypti such an effective spreader of yellow fever?
It's almost perfectly adapted to urban environments. It thrives in standing water common in tropical cities. And unlike many other species, it prefers human blood and bites during the day, making it a stealthy and persistent threat.
Okay, so we've got this tiny mosquito perfectly adapted to spread disease in densely populated areas. Once it's infected, it can transmit yellow fever for its entire life. Bad news, right?
It is, but the identification of the mosquito as the vector was a turning point.
Okay.
Finally, public health efforts could target the source of the problem.
And they did Havana. Using mosquito control measures like draining stagnant water and promoting awareness, saw a dramatic decrease in cases. It seemed like a victory.
It was, but this victory was limited to the urban cycle of yellow fever. Remember, there's another side to this story,
Okay.
the sylvatic cycle. This is where things get even more complex.
The sylvatic cycle, is this where we start talking about monkeys in jungles?
Exactly. In the jungle, monkeys act as a natural reservoir for the virus, and a different type of mosquito transmits it between them. Humans who enter these areas can become infected, essentially bringing the virus back into urban areas.
So even with successes controlling the urban cycle, yellow fever was still lurking in the shadows, ready to jump back into human populations. Mosquito control alone wasn't enough.
And that's where the next chapter of our story begins, the quest for a vaccine. But we'll dive into that in the next part of our deep dive. So we left off with this realization: controlling the mosquito wasn't enough.
Right.
We needed a way to protect people directly from the virus itself.
Enter the quest for a vaccine, but we're not just talking about any vaccine.
Right.
They needed something safe, effective, and capable of being produced on a massive scale.
This was no small feat. The Rockefeller Foundation took on this challenge, and a brilliant South African virologist named Max Theiler emerged as a key figure in this story. His goal was to weaken the yellow fever virus to make it trigger an immune response without causing the full-blown disease.
This was in the 1920s and 30s, right? Not exactly a time of high-tech labs and gene editing. How did he even approach something like that?
Theiler used a clever technique called passaging. He repeatedly passed the virus through mice, which over time caused it to lose its virulence for humans while still retaining its ability to trigger immunity.
So the virus got trained to be Less harmful, but still recognizable to the immune system. That's fascinating.
Exactly. But to make the vaccine even safer and easier to produce, Thaler took it a step further. He adapted the virus to grow in chicken embryos, which further weakened it and paved the way for mass production.
This is where we get the famous 17D vaccine right, named after this specific strain of the virus. Thaler used, it sounds like, a turning point in the fight against yellow fever.
The 17D vaccine was incredibly effective, providing long-lasting immunity with minimal side effects. It was a game changer for global public health mass vaccination campaigns in Africa and South America, where yellow fever was rampant, drastically reduced the incidence of the disease, especially in urban areas.
That's a remarkable achievement.
Yeah.
So, mystery solved, vaccine developed, case closed.
Well, not so fast. The 17D vaccine was a triumph. But as with any medical intervention, there were challenges. First, the production of the vaccine is complex and requires specialized facilities. Second, maintaining a consistent supply to meet global demand is a logistical feat, especially during outbreaks.
So even with a highly effective vaccine, there are limitations, and then there's the sylvatic cycle. No vaccine can fully protect against a virus lurking in the jungle, right?
That's the problem. And to make matters even more complicated, yellow fever is making a comeback. In recent decades, we've seen significant outbreaks, particularly in Angola and Brazil, serving as stark reminders that this disease is far from a relic of the past.
Wait, outbreaks, but we have the vaccine? What's driving this resurgence?
It's a combination of factors. One is urbanizations. Cities in the tropics are experiencing rapid population growth, creating dense environments that are perfect breeding grounds for the Aedes aegypti mosquito.
So more people, more mosquitoes, more opportunities for the virus to spread. But what about the vaccine? Weren't people vaccinated?
Unfortunately, there were gaps in vaccination coverage. Many people, especially in rapidly growing urban areas, had never received the yellow fever vaccine. And even in areas with vaccination programs, keeping up with the growing population and ensuring everyone is protected is a constant challenge.
I see. It's not just about having the vaccine. It's about reaching everyone who needs it. Can you tell me more about these recent outbreaks? What happened in Angola?
In late 2015, Angola experienced its first major yellow fever outbreak in decades. It began in Luanda, the capital city, and quickly spiraled out of control, overwhelming healthcare systems and claiming hundreds of lives.
That's terrifying. So you have this combination of rapid urbanization gaps in vaccination coverage and a highly contagious virus. What did they do?
The World Health Organization coordinated an emergency response, but they faced a major hurdle. The global vaccine supply was simply not enough to meet the demand.
Wait, a shortage? How can there be a shortage of a vaccine that's been around for decades?
Remember, the 17D vaccine is complex to manufacture, and only a handful of facilities around the world produce its solution. Sudden surges in demand, like during a major outbreak, can easily outstrip supply.
So what do they do? Just let the outbreak run its course?
No, they came up with a brilliant solution: fractional dosing.
Fractional dosing, you mean giving people smaller amounts of the vaccine?
Exactly. Research showed that even 1/5 of the standard dose could provide protection, at least in the short term. This allowed them to stretch the limited vaccine supply much further, reaching a greater number of people.
Wow, that's amazing. It's like a medical MacGyver move, using limited resources to achieve maximum impact.
It was a remarkable feat of ingenuity and collaboration. The fractional dosing strategy, combined with public health measures like mosquito control and public awareness campaigns, helped bring the Angola outbreak under control.
That's a relief to hear, but it highlights the precariousness of relying on a limited global vaccine supply, especially when facing a rapidly spreading disease.
Absolutely. And the Angola outbreak wasn't an isolated event around the same time. Brazil was also grappling with a series of major yellow fever outbreaks, but these outbreaks had a different origin. They started in rural forested areas, fueled by that sylvatic cycle we talked about earlier.
Right, the jungle reservoir. But how did these outbreaks jump from remote areas to major cities like Sao Paulo and Rio?
Human activity plays a key role. Deforestation and agricultural expansion are pushing deeper into forested areas, increasing the chances of people encountering infected mosquitoes.
It's like we're encroaching on their territory and the virus is taking advantage. So even with vaccination programs, we can't escape the reality of the sylvatic cycle.
Yeah.
What happens when these outbreaks reach densely populated urban areas?
The potential for a large-scale outbreak becomes very real, and this is where things get even more complex because there's another factor at play, one that has the potential to reshape the entire landscape of infectious diseases: climate change.
Climate change, it seems like everything these days is connected to climate change. How does it impact yellow fever specifically?
It comes down to the mosquitoes. Rising temperatures and changes in rainfall patterns are expanding the geographic range of the mosquitoes that transmit yellow fever, both the Aedes aegypti and those involved in the sylvatic cycle.
So areas that are once too cold for these mosquitoes are now becoming suitable habitats. That means the risk of yellow fever is spreading to new regions, right?
Exactly. And it's not just a theoretical risk. We're already seeing this happening in parts of Africa. Rising temperatures are pushing mosquito habitats into higher altitudes and more southern latitudes.
Climate change is essentially adding fuel to the fire, making an already complex problem even more challenging.
Yeah.
It feels like we're stuck in a constant game of catch-up, trying to stay one step ahead of this evolving threat.
It can feel that way, but it's important to remember that we're not powerless. We've made remarkable progress in understanding and controlling yellow fever, and there are ongoing efforts to address these modern challenges, and those efforts are showing real promise. But we'll dive into that in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into yellow fever, from its historical impact to its modern resurgence.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about mosquito control vaccines and even the looming threat of climate change. It's a complex story, but thankfully it's not all doom and gloom. So for this final chapter, let's talk about hope. What's being done on a global scale to tackle these challenges?
Well, the good news is the global community recognizes the threat and is actively working to prevent it from becoming a major health crisis. There's a truly inspiring level of international collaboration happening.
Okay, in all ears, tell me more about these global efforts. What are some of the key strategies involved?
One of the most ambitious efforts is the Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemic Strategy, or I.
I strategy.
Yeah, launched back in 2017 by the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and Gavi the Vaccine Alliance.
Yeah.
The I strategy represents a comprehensive approach tackling the issue on multiple fronts.
I strategy, catchy name.
Yeah.
Sounds like they're really focused on getting rid of this thing once and for all.
Huh.
What's the vision behind this initiative?
The I strategy has three main pillars. First, protect at-risk populations through vaccination. Second, strengthen outbreak detection and response systems. And third, ensure a sustainable global supply of yellow fever vaccines.
Okay, so it's about prevention detection and having the resources to respond effectively makes sense. But we've already talked about the challenges with vaccine production and distribution.
Mhm.
How does the EYE strategy address those issues?
One key area is investment. The I-White strategy is pushing for increased funding to expand vaccine manufacturing capacity. Remember, only a handful of facilities worldwide produce the 17D vaccine, and we've seen how quickly supplies can run low during outbreaks, so expanding production is absolutely crucial.
More vaccines, more people protected. It seems straightforward enough. What about getting those vaccines to the people who need them, especially in remote or under-resourced areas?
That's where the second pillar of the IYE strategy comes, in strengthening health systems in high-risk countries, primarily in Africa and South America.
Okay.
We're talking about improving transportation networks, ensuring reliable cold chain storage for vaccines, and providing training for healthcare workers.
So it's not just about having vaccines, it's about building the infrastructure and expertise to deliver them effectively. It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is, but the progress is real. And remember, the IE strategy also focuses on improving outbreak detection and response.
Right.
This means investing in surveillance systems so countries can identify outbreaks early and act quickly to contain them.
We talked earlier about those primate sentinel programs where scientists monitor monkey populations for signs of yellow fever. Are those still a key part of surveillance efforts?
Absolutely. Monitoring monkeys remains one of our best early warning systems if monkeys start getting sick. It's a sign that the virus is circulating and humans in the area could be at risk, but we're not just relying on monkeys anymore.
What else is being done? Any high-tech tools in the mix?
Intergenomics. Remember how we discussed its role in tracing the origins and spread of those recent outbreaks? Well, the IY strategy is leveraging genomic sequencing to create a global surveillance network for yellow fever.
So by analyzing the genetic code of the virus, scientists can track its movements, identify new strains, and potentially even predict where it might spread next. That's incredible.
It is, and this kind of real-time genomic surveillance is becoming increasingly important, not just for yellow fever, but for tracking all kinds of infectious diseases. It's allowing us to stay one step ahead of the game.
It's like having a global map of the virus's movements constantly updating in real time. I can see how that would be a game changer for outbreak response. But surveillance can only do so much. What happens when an outbreak is detected?
That's where having a sustainable global supply of vaccines becomes essential. The IIE strategy has helped establish an emergency vaccine stockpile specifically for responding to outbreaks.
Okay.
This stockpile is managed by the WHO and provides a critical safety net when demand outstrips supply.
That's reassuring. It's like having a global emergency fund for yellow fever vaccine.
Exactly. It allows for a rapid response even in remote or under-resourced areas, but it's important to remember that the stockpile is a finite resource. The ultimate goal is to increase overall vaccine production capacity to meet the long-term demand.
Right. A stockpile is just a temporary solution. We need a more sustainable approach.
And that's what the IIA strategy is pushing for. They're investing in research and development, exploring new vaccine technologies, and working to make existing vaccines more stable and easier to distribute. They're also looking at innovative ways to stretch existing supplies, like those fractional dose strategies we talked about earlier.
So there's hope on the horizon. But
Yeah.
even with all these efforts, it sounds like yellow fever is going to remain a challenge for the foreseeable future, especially with the added pressure of climate change.
You're right. We can't eradicate the virus completely because of that sylvatic cycle. The jungle reservoir will always be there, but we can learn to live with it, manage the risk, and prevent large-scale outbreaks.
And that's where all these global efforts come, in vaccination surveillance research and international collaboration. It's a multi-pronged approach, and honestly, it gives me a sense of optimism even in the face of such a complex and persistent threat.
Me too. The story of yellow fever is a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. We've faced this disease for centuries, and with each challenge, we've learned, adapted, and developed new tools to fight back. That's a powerful lesson, not just for yellow fever, but for how we approach global health challenges as a global community.
Absolutely. We've come a long way from those terrifying outbreaks in 18th century Philadelphia. We've unraveled the mystery of the mosquito vector, developed a life-saving vaccine, and even harnessed the power of genomics to track the virus's every move. But as we've learned, the fight is far from over. Yellow fever reminds us that infectious diseases constantly evolve, and we need to be prepared to adapt and innovate to stay ahead of the game.
And perhaps the most important takeaway from our deep dive is the power of collaboration. No single country, no single organization can tackle a global health threat like yellow fever alone. It requires a collective effort, a shared commitment to research prevention and response. That message resonates far beyond the realm of infectious diseases. It's a call to action for all of us to work together to build a healthier and more resilient future.
Beautifully put. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of yellow fever. We hope you've learned something new, gained a new perspective, and maybe even felt a flicker of inspiration. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.